in the winter of 1847, when the wind cut through the Carolina marshes like a blade made of ice and memory, there were whispers carried through the reeds, whispers of a pale woman holding a lantern that never flickered, no matter how violently the storm screamed around her. Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was not meant for the ears of ordinary men. It is a truth that slips between the cracks of history, recorded only in the shivers of those who survived long enough to speak, and buried again by those who feared what would happen if the world truly understood. Imagine the night stretched thin, like an old sheet pulled over a corpse. The year is fading, the moon hangs low and swollen, and the road is empty except for one traveler, a man returning home after months of trade. He hears footsteps behind him, soft, careful, as if the night itself has begun to walk. He turns and sees her, a woman, draped in pale cloth soaked with winter mist, holding a lantern made of iron too old for the era, glowing with a dim, honey-colored light that feels neither warm nor alive. She says nothing. She only gestures with her hand, slowly, gently, inviting him to follow. And men did. They followed her into the marsh, into the woods, into the fog that swallowed their breath. They followed her because she looked like salvation, because her lantern seemed to promise warmth, safety, home. But none of them ever reached their door. This story is not a ghost tale from drunken hunters or trembling housewives. It is documented, hidden deep inside county archives, half-burnt newspaper clippings, and private journals stained with fear. Something walked those roads. Something guided men away from their fate. Something with a purpose older than the towns built on stolen land. And tonight, you and I are going to reopen the door that history sealed shut. But understand this, once you learn the truth behind the Lantern Woman, you do not get to return to who you were before. You can only move forward, deeper into the dark. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. Before we go deeper, you must understand the world she walked in, the land that shaped her legend, the silence that fed her hunger. Because nothing monstrous appears without a reason, and the Lantern Woman was born from a place already drowning in shadows long before her lantern first glowed across the winter roads. It was a time when communities were small, isolated, and bound together by fear as much as faith. In the 1840s, travel through the Carolina marshlands was not a journey. It was a test of endurance. Men rode miles through swamps that swallowed horses whole, through forests so dense they devoured the moonlight, through fog that clung to the skin like a living thing. And yet, life seemed deceptively ordinary during the day. Children ran barefoot through muddy paths, merchants shouted along market stalls, church bells rang every Sunday as if they could cleanse the sins of the land simply by vibrating the air. But beneath this fragile shell of normalcy lay rumors, quiet, persistent, and old. Travelers spoke of lights drifting through the marshes at night, lights that moved against the wind, lights that paused when watched, lights that vanished when followed. The elders warned that the marshes did not forgive mistakes. They said some places were never meant for human footsteps, that some paths were carved not by men but by something older, patient, waiting. And if you asked the oldest families, the ones who had lived there since before the Revolution, they would tell you stories their grandmothers whispered by firelight. Stories of a woman who once guided lost soldiers through the swamp during a winter storm, only for every one of those soldiers to vanish without a trace. Stories of a lantern that glowed even when submerged under water. Stories of a face pale as riverbone, eyes black as night fire, and a voice that could coax the weary into walking blindly toward their own silence. People ignored these warnings because ordinary life makes men comfortable. Comfort makes men blind. And blindness is what the Lantern Woman fed on. But back then, they still believed she was a myth, an echo of fear from a time when the world was more cruel. They didn't yet understand that myths are simply truths wrapped in time. And now, before we step deeper into the dark, I need something from you. If you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. To understand the Lantern Woman, you must first understand the life she touched and the life she destroyed. Every legend begins with a person, a face, a heartbeat. And if the stories are true, then long before she walked the marshes with that impossible lantern, she was simply a girl, someone who lived, suffered, and broke in ways the world was never meant to witness. Her name, at least in the surviving records, was Eliza Harrow. Born in 1819 to a family that lived on the very edge of the marsh, She grew up in a house where the walls were always damp and the windows never fully kept out the cold. Her father was a fisherman who spent more time in the river than on land. Her mother was a quiet woman with a strange habit. She lit a lantern every night and left it on the porch, even when storms made the flame tremble like a dying breath. She told neighbors it was just in case someone needed guidance home. But those who lived nearby claimed they often awoke to see the lantern glowing much farther from the house than the porch, deep within the trees, swaying gently, as if someone else were carrying it. Eliza herself was not like other children. She spoke softly, walked lightly, and listened more than she ever talked. Teachers wrote that she stared out windows during lessons, as if hearing something in the distance. A few said she seemed half here, half elsewhere. When she turned 10, witnesses claimed she disappeared for a full night, only to be found standing barefoot at the edge of the marsh at sunrise, holding her mother's lantern, except the wick was unlit, yet the glass still glowed with a strange, amber light. People tried to ignore it. Rural life breeds superstition, and superstition breeds silence. But small things continued. Animals refused to go near her. Dogs growled. Horses pulled away. Birds quieted when she walked under a tree. And then there were the travelers. Several wrote in their journals found years later, that a young girl with a lantern watched them from the tree line as they passed. Some felt comforted. Some felt fear. All of them disappeared within weeks. Eliza Harrow became a name people stopped saying out loud. Not because they feared her, but because they feared what she was becoming. And now, we step deeper. You can trace the beginning of the true unraveling to a single winter, 1837, when the marshes froze harder than anyone had seen in 50 years. That year, the disappearances stopped being whispers and began carving themselves into the daily fears of those who lived along the old trade road. And at the center of every trembling rumor was that same pale girl with the lantern. The first strange event involved a trapper named Samuel Brigg, a hard man with calloused hands and a reputation for never believing anything he couldn't kill or drink. He returned from a long hunt with a story he refused to tell sober. Only when he was deep into a bottle of corn whiskey did he whisper the truth. He had followed the glow of a lantern deeper into the marsh than he had ever dared, thinking it belonged to another hunter. He shouted. No one answered. The lantern kept drifting ahead of him, always just far enough to make him chase. But the marsh was frozen. There should have been no footprints, no marks, no disturbance. Yet the lantern moved. When he finally caught up, he found a young girl standing on a patch of ice so thin he could see black water beneath it. She stared at him with a stillness that made his breath stop. And the lantern, her lantern, burned without flame. He swore that when he blinked, she vanished. The lantern dropped. The ice cracked. And something beneath the water grabbed at his legs. Samuel escaped, but he never again spoke of what pulled him under. He simply left town the next morning and was never seen again. Around the same time, two brothers went missing on their way home from a winter gathering. Their horse returned without them, covered in marsh mud. A week later, a traveling doctor reported seeing a thin girl with a glowing lantern leading two men down a wooded trail. He assumed she was guiding them home. Those men were the brothers. Their bodies were discovered months later, sunk deep in the marsh bed, preserved by the cold. Their faces were turned upward, as if they died staring at something above them, not with fear, but with awe. This was the beginning of the unfolding, the moment when the town realized something was walking alongside them, watching them, choosing them. And still, no one understood what the lantern woman wanted. The truth began to surface slowly, like bones rising through river mud after a storm. By 1840, the lantern woman was no longer a rumor passed between drunks and widows. She had become a pattern, an impossible, undeniable pattern, woven through every disappearance, every strange sighting, every traveler who followed a gentle light and never returned. And the stories became more conflicted, more distorted, more dangerous. One account came from a preacher's wife named Margaret Turner, a woman known for her strict honesty. She claimed she saw Eliza, though by then, people rarely used her name, standing at the crossroads near their church. It was dusk, the sky bruised purple, fog crawling over the ground like living breath. Eliza held her lantern high, the glow pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves. Margaret said the light felt wrong, like something inside her was being tugged toward it. But here's where the story fractures. Margaret insisted the girl's face was calm, innocent, almost sorrowful. She believed the lantern woman was trying to warn her of something, that the light was a signal, not a trap. 3 days later, a young man named Owen Fitch told the opposite tale. He swore the girl's face was twisted with hunger, her eyes empty, her presence suffocating. He claimed her lantern pulse matched the rhythm of his heartbeat, speeding up as she approached. He said he ran because he felt she wanted to consume him, not kill, not guide, but absorb him into something beyond comprehension. 2 witnesses, 2 truths that could not exist together. And yet, both sounded believable. Doctors at the time blamed marsh vapors, claiming people were hallucinating. But their reports were inconsistent. One doctor wrote that Eliza's supposed sightings were due to collective madness. Another secretly recorded that he, too, had seen the lantern, and described it as light without fire, warmth without heat, flame without fuel. As these contradictions spread, the marsh changed. Roads once safe became pathways of dread. Travelers felt watched. Campsites were found abandoned. Footprints appeared overnight, small and bare, circling wagons like a predator studying its prey. And worst of all, the lantern sightings grew more frequent, as if the girl was learning, evolving, choosing more carefully. This was no longer about fear. It was about intention. And the deeper we go, the clearer her intention becomes. Shall we descend further? There comes a point in every hidden history where fear stops being the enemy, and uncertainty takes its place. When a man can no longer tell whether the danger lies before him or inside him. That point arrived in the marshlands in the autumn of 1841, when the sightings of the lantern woman shifted from isolated encounters to something far more coordinated, almost ritualistic, as if she were following steps to a pattern only she could see. It began with a merchant caravan traveling from Wilmington to Charleston. They moved in a group of 6 experienced men, hardened by miles, wise enough not to chase shadows. For most of their journey, the marsh remained quiet. But on the 3rd night, as the fog thickened into a wall of living milk, they saw a faint glow drifting beside the trees. At first, they thought it was another traveler. Then they realized it moved too steadily, too smoothly, unaffected by the wind. One man, the youngest, claimed he saw a girl standing beside the light. Another said he saw only the lantern, floating alone like a firefly made of bone and memory. A third swore he heard footsteps pacing in sync with the glow, matching every beat of his heart. They argued. They shouted. And in the confusion, they lost sight of the lantern entirely. By morning, 2 men were missing. Their bodies were found days later, lying face up in shallow water, their expressions strangely peaceful. Not fearful, not pained, peaceful, as if they willingly let themselves drown. This was not the only case. A fisherman rowing home late one evening saw the lantern hovering above the river, reflecting perfectly in water that should have rippled in the wind. He said the light bent toward him, like a living creature tasting the air. He returned to shore shaking, mumbling that the lantern knew his name. A midwife walking home from a birth saw the girl sitting on a log, lantern beside her, humming a lullaby no human child had ever sung. When the midwife blinked, she claimed the girl's mouth didn't close. It simply wasn't there anymore. Just smooth, pale skin. And perhaps most chilling of all was the journal entry left by a passing scholar. I saw her. She is not a child. She is not a woman. She is not dead. She is not alive. She is the path between. With each encounter, her presence grew less human and more deliberate. She wasn't haunting the marsh. She was recruiting it. There's a moment in every dark legend when the people finally realize that what stalks them is not random, not accidental, not confused. It is deliberate, purposeful, intelligent. For the marshland towns, that moment came in 1842, when the lantern woman began mirroring human behavior with unsettling precision, as if she were studying the living in order to perfect the act of wearing their shape. The shift began quietly, almost too subtly to notice. Travelers whispered that they heard humming behind them, a long, slow melody that matched the cadence of old church hymns, even though no one else walked the road. Some claimed they heard their own names spoken in a girl's voice, carried on the wind with chilling accuracy. Others swore they saw footprints alongside theirs in the mud. Bay footprints. Small, but pressed deep into the earth as though made by something terribly heavy. But these were just the preludes. The true horror unfolded one night when a small family, father, mother, and a young boy, returned late from visiting relatives. They were tired, half asleep, yet the boy insisted they weren't alone on the road. He kept asking, "Who's the lady walking next to us?" But his parents saw nothing. They dismissed it as childish imagination, until the lantern appeared. It materialized ahead of them, soft and glowing, swaying gently as if held by a steady hand. The father shouted, asking who was there. The lantern didn't move, didn't shake, didn't respond. Instead, a voice, the mother's voice, echoed from the darkness. "Come toward the light. We're almost home." Except the mother hadn't spoken. Her lips were trembling, frozen with terror. The father grabbed his boy, pulled him back, and urged his wife to run. But the lantern drifted closer, cutting through the fog like a scalpel. And for the briefest second, they saw her, the girl, standing completely still, her hair suspended as if underwater, her face half hidden by the lantern's glow. The father described her expression later as neither welcoming nor threatening, just observing. As if she was learning them, as if she was practicing. The family escaped only because a patrol rider appeared on the road. The lantern vanished instantly, as though snuffed out by an unseen hand. But the damage was done. The lantern woman wasn't guiding travelers anymore. She was imitating them, testing what it meant to be human. And with each passing night, she got better. Fear changes a community. It reshapes the way men speak, the way women pray, the way children sleep. By 1843, the marshland towns were no longer simply afraid of the lantern woman. They were altered by her. She had become a presence that lived between every whispered word, a shadow seated at every dinner table, an unseen witness standing behind every lantern-lit window. What terrified people most wasn't her appearance. It was her selectiveness. She didn't appear to everyone. She didn't follow everyone. She chose. And once she chose you, the town believed there was no force on earth, no priest, no sheriff, no family, that could unchoose you. The first confirmation of this came from a hunter named Tobias Crane. He was a gruff, stubborn man, someone who mocked ghost stories and laughed at danger. But even he couldn't ignore what began happening to him. It started with small things, waking up to find muddy footprints on his doorstep, hearing a lantern knock against his window at night, seeing a flicker of amber light between trees while he worked. He told himself it was his imagination, until the night he returned home and found his door slightly ajar. Inside, every lantern in his cabin, all 5, were lit, but none contained flame. They glowed with the same unnatural warmth as her lantern. In his journal, Tobias wrote, "The light felt alive. It breathed. I swear it breathed." His neighbors tried to help. They prayed. They stayed with him through the night. But at exactly midnight, every lantern inside the house flickered at once, synchronized like a heartbeat. And outside, through the frost on the window, they saw her silhouette standing perfectly still at the tree line, lantern raised to her chest, as though claiming him. Tobias fled the next morning. He boarded a wagon headed north. The townsfolk believed he had escaped her, until the wagon was found days later near the river. The horses were alive, untouched. The supplies were still there. The tracks showed no attack, no struggle. But Tobias Crane was gone. A single lantern, not his, sat in the driver's seat, glowing without flame. This changed everything. It meant she could reach beyond the marsh. It meant distance didn't matter. It meant once she marked someone, she followed. And the question that kept every man awake at night was the same. What did she want from the one she chose? We continue deeper. By 1844, the pattern was undeniable. The lantern woman was no longer an anomaly, no longer a story for scared children or drunken men. She had become a force, one that operated with strategy and patience. And unlike any other force in the marshes, she didn't just take, she taught. She didn't simply vanish, she tested. Those who followed her never returned the same, if they returned at all. Consider the case of Jeremiah Cross, a scholar traveling through the marsh to document plant life. He was meticulous, rational, and unafraid, or so he believed. When he encountered the lantern, he didn't flee. He followed. Step by step, he moved deeper into the fog, cataloging each detail. The lantern paused when he paused. It moved faster when he quickened his pace. It seemed aware, responsive. Jeremy noted it in his journal. It is not a girl. It is a mind that studies. By the third night, Jeremy had mapped 3 different paths of disappearance, all converging near a section of marsh so dense it had no trails, no waterway, no passage for any man. Yet, as he wrote, the lantern appeared ahead of him again. He felt compelled to step forward. Something whispered in the back of his mind, not a voice, but a presence, guiding him, telling him, "You must see." He followed. The next day, a local farmer discovered his notebook in the reeds. Every entry detailed the lantern's movements, the temperature, the fog density, but the final pages were smeared, illegible. In the margins, someone had written, in letters that were not Jeremiah's, "You are ready." No trace of Jeremiah Cross was ever found. His belongings remained on the path, untouched. His boots lay beside the marsh reeds. Only the notebook survived, cryptic, ominous, and incomplete. And here's the unthinkable truth. By then, townspeople realized she was no longer a passive hunter of the lost. She was a recruiter. She selected, she studied, she educated, transforming her victims before swallowing them. Some survivors, whispered in hushed tones, claimed that following her changed them forever. They remembered every step, every shadow, every whispered breath. And they were never quite human afterward. The lantern woman was no longer just a girl in the marsh. She was the marsh itself, patient, eternal, indifferent to mortal fate. And the question that haunted anyone who glimpsed her lantern was no longer how do I escape? The question was how do I resist being remade by her? We are only beginning to understand her design. Only now do we glimpse the true machinery behind her existence. And when we reach the heart of this story, you will understand why men, once mocked, are never the same. By 1845, it became clear that the lantern woman was no longer constrained by mere geography. She existed in patterns, in rituals, in the very rhythms of the marsh. Travelers who had once believed her appearances were random now understood. She had a system, a method, a curriculum that only the chosen could survive. And this is where the stories take a turn from fear to obsession, the kind of obsession that seeps into the mind and refuses to leave. One account survives from a merchant's journal, found decades later in the attic of a house that had been abandoned for years. He wrote of walking at dusk, lantern in hand, following the soft glow of her light. "It called to me," he wrote, "as if it knew my thoughts, my desires, the exact angle at which I would hesitate. I wanted to run, but my feet betrayed me. Every step toward it felt like learning a secret I was unworthy to hear. By the time the moon rose fully, I was no longer walking. I was being guided, not merely by her, but by a will older than the road itself." And that is the key. The lantern woman was more than a ghost, more than a girl. She was intelligence, old and deliberate, embedded in every reed, every frozen stream, every fog-drenched path. Those who followed her did not merely dissipate. They were tested, broken down, rebuilt in a shadowed pattern that the townspeople could not understand. And when men returned, and some did, they carried a glow in their eyes, a hush in their voices, an unspoken understanding that the world they had left behind was no longer theirs. By now, her methodology had evolved. She no longer approached indiscriminately. She watched. She waited. She studied the habits of travelers and townsfolk alike, observing their schedules, their fears, their attachments. And when the moment was right, she appeared, a single amber light floating in the fog, patient and deliberate. A hand beckoning, a pause, a test of will. The chosen were always those who were curious, stubborn, or unwilling to leave unanswered questions. The willing prey, men who sought mastery of the unknown, were drawn like moths to a flame that would consume them entirely. It is here that we begin to see her agenda, a psychological dominion, not of violence, but of influence. A way to take men and bend them to the rhythm of her lantern, to the cadence of her marsh. And if you are listening closely now, you can feel the same pull, subtle, patient, insistent, asking, will you follow? By the spring of 1846, the lantern woman's influence had grown beyond mere sightings. Entire families spoke in whispers about the lantern glowing in the woods, even when no one had gone outside. The townsfolk realized, slowly and with growing terror, that she was no longer just a predator of travelers. She was a force of observation, of control, of quiet corruption. She was rewriting the rules of the marsh, and anyone who crossed her path risked being rewritten as well. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a traveling schoolmaster, Thomas Reed. He arrived at the village with a horse and a satchel full of books, hoping to teach the children beyond the edge of the swamp. On his first night, he saw her lantern in the distance, swaying like a heartbeat. Intrigued, he followed it, step by step, deeper into the marsh, his rational mind trying to catalogue what he saw, his instinct screaming to turn back. He kept detailed notes, the way the fog clung to his coat, the unnatural steadiness of the light, the faint whisper of his own name carried on the wind. By dawn, he was found sitting on a fallen log near the riverbank. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was a strange, calm smile on his face. He spoke in a low, measured tone. "I understand now. She teaches. She shows you the paths. But only if you are willing to see." When asked what he meant, he could only point to the marsh and murmur, "The road never ends." And this is the pattern that would become legendary. The Lantern Woman did not merely lead men to their deaths. She tested their minds. She offered understanding, glimpses of hidden truths, glimpses of power they had never imagined. But her lessons came at a cost. Obedience, curiosity, submission. Those who resisted were punished, lost, or vanished entirely. Those who followed became part of a design, altered, unrecognizable to those who had known them. The townspeople began calling it the choosing. Not every traveler who saw the lantern would be taken, but the ones she selected, they were never the same again. The line between fear and fascination blurred. People found themselves drawn to the roads at night, wondering if they would see the lantern, if they would be chosen. And this is the danger she wielded most effectively. She made men complicit in their own undoing. And now, as we move forward, you must understand something crucial. To follow the Lantern Woman is not merely to risk your life. It is to risk who you are. To risk everything you have believed about control, choice, and reality itself. By the summer of 1846, the marsh itself seemed alive. The wind carried whispers, the reeds shifted unnaturally, and travelers reported glimpses of movement where nothing should have been. It was in this season that the Lantern Woman's pattern became unmistakable. She was no longer appearing randomly. She had begun orchestrating encounters, selecting not just the curious or foolish, but the ambitious, the restless, the men who thought themselves in control of their own destinies. And she was patient. She waited. She observed. She studied. One account tells of a logger named Elias Whitmore. He was strong, pragmatic, and had spent decades surviving in the marshlands. Yet even he could not resist the pull of the light. He followed it for miles, noting the way it moved, faster when he hesitated, slower when he rushed, always keeping just ahead of him, just beyond reach. And then, when he thought he had lost it, it appeared again, closer, somehow waiting for him to notice it. Elias described the sensation in his journal, later recovered from a burned-down cabin. "It knows me. It knows my fear, my arrogance, even my hope. I feel it inside my head, guiding me toward the fog, toward the water, toward something I cannot name." He vanished that night. Only his axe and his coat were found, neatly placed at the edge of the marsh as if left as an offering. No struggle, no signs of violence, only the marsh and the lingering glow of the lantern, receding into the fog. And this is what made her terrifying. She did not attack. She did not threaten. She taught. She tempted. She drew men into a dance they could not comprehend. By the time the townsfolk realized the truth, entire families were speaking in hushed tones about the roads at night, about the lantern appearing at impossible hours, about the pull it exerted on those who walked near. People began marking the paths. They tried to map sightings, to understand the timing, to predict when she would appear. And yet, no map worked. No pattern could hold against her. She moved with intelligence. She adapted. She studied the humans as a predator studies its prey, and she rewarded curiosity with obsession. Some men claimed that seeing the lantern changed them. They spoke of understanding things they could not articulate, truths about the world that seemed wrong, dangerous, forbidden. And in every account, the warning was the same. The lantern does not simply guide you home. It guides you towards something far darker. By the winter of 1846, the Lantern Woman was no longer a story for the faint-hearted. She had become a presence that defined the marsh, a consciousness that bent reality around her will. Men spoke in hushed tones, afraid that even mentioning her name would call her closer. The marsh became a mirror of their deepest fears, reflecting not just what was outside, but what lurked inside their own minds. And she, The Lantern Woman was the artist painting that reflection with light that burned without flame. It began with reports that she had begun following patterns of behavior rather than paths. Men who had once traveled safely at night suddenly vanished without warning. Families reported hearing the soft pulse of her lantern outside windows, synchronized with the heartbeat of the house itself. Horses grew skittish, dogs whined, and children refused to leave the porch after dusk. Everyone knew she was near, even if they could not see her. One particularly chilling account comes from a trader named William Hart. He traveled the roads carrying goods to Charleston, and on a fog-laden evening, he noticed a faint glow ahead. Curiosity overcame caution, and he followed. The lantern moved with him, anticipating his steps, adjusting as though it could read his mind. By midnight, he found himself in a clearing he had never seen before, surrounded by fog so thick it pressed against his chest like water. The lantern floated before him, unmoving, and for the first time he realized he could not see anything else. The trees, the ground, the sky, all disappeared. Only the light remained. Hart's journal, later recovered, describes what happened next. It spoke without words. It showed me shapes in the fog, impossible, endless corridors, faces of men I knew, twisted and staring. I understood nothing, yet I felt compelled to step forward. I was learning, becoming part of the rhythm of the marsh. And then, I blinked, and I was alone. But I am not the same man. I feel her watching, always. The Lantern Woman's method had evolved from guiding travelers to manipulating minds, bending perception, teaching obedience through terror. She was no longer just a predator. She was a system, an intelligence, a teacher of forbidden truths. And the townsfolk began to understand that she would not stop. She was patient, eternal, and she would take only those who were willing to follow, willingly or not. And as we continue, understand this. Those who follow her do not merely vanish. They transform. And if you are listening closely, you may already feel the lantern's pull. By the spring of 1847, the Lantern Woman had become less a legend and more a law of the marsh. People no longer spoke of her as a warning. They spoke of her as inevitability. The roads were measured in fear, and every traveler understood that a single amber light in the fog could mean more than death. It could mean transformation. It could mean being claimed, studied, and remade. One story comes from a man named Samuel Reed, a cartographer mapping the marshlands for a wealthy patron. He described seeing the lantern at dusk, hovering between two oaks as if it were balancing itself on the edges of reality. He followed, notebook in hand, heart pounding not with fear, but with the irresistible curiosity that had marked every man who vanished before him. Step by step, he moved deeper, noticing the fog thickening around him, the night bending subtly toward the glow, the sounds of his own breathing amplified, as though someone else were counting each inhale. He wrote in painstaking detail, "It waits. Not for me to flee, not for me to fight. It waits for me to understand, to see the pattern. And I do. I feel it in my bones. The marsh itself is learning me, shaping me. I am no longer moving, I am being moved." And when I blinked, I realized I could see the paths of men before me, the ways they disappeared, the rhythms of their following. It is not cruel. It is precise. And I wish to learn more. Samuel never returned. His maps were found weeks later, water-stained, detailing roads that did not exist, rivers that flowed backward, and lantern-shaped sigils etched into corners of pages. The townspeople who examined them swore the symbols pulsed faintly, like embers. And this is what the Lantern Woman had become: a teacher of impossible geography, a manipulator of perception, a force that turned fear into knowledge, knowledge into obsession, and obsession into transformation. She did not merely remove men from the world, she rewrote their understanding of it, bending their minds to the rhythm of her lantern. By now, entire families lived in a quiet panic, unwilling to let men travel alone, unwilling to walk roads after dark, unwilling to admit that the light had become a law, a force that could not be negotiated with, outrun, or avoided. She had become an intelligence, and the intelligence was patient. And now, as we continue, we reach the halfway point of our journey. The darkness you feel is no longer outside. It is inside you. Write in the comments twice the phrase, "I follow the light." Lock your transformation, engage your mind, and step fully into the path. By midsummer of 1847, the Lantern Woman's presence was no longer subtle. It had begun shaping the very lives of those who lived near the marsh, bending families, influencing decisions, and mocking men with a quiet, undeniable obsession. She was no longer merely a shadow in the fog. She was a pulse in the air, a rhythm in the trees, a cadence that whispered in every heart willing to hear it. Those who had glimpsed her lantern carried a weight that others could not see, a knowledge they could not share, and a hunger they did not understand. Consider the account of Jonathan Hale, a woodsman whose wife had died the previous winter. He was hardened, practical, the kind of man who scoffed at stories of spirits and strange lights. Yet one fog-laden evening, as he returned from the market, he saw her, the pale girl, standing perfectly still, lantern glowing softly in her hand. He froze, rational thought battling instinct. The lantern swayed as though acknowledging his hesitation. It was not threatening. It was beckoning. And for reasons he could not explain, he moved closer. Hale described the encounter later in a letter, smuggled from a nearby town. I felt no fear at first, only understanding. The lantern seemed to recognize me, to know my pain, my loss, my loneliness. And when I followed, it was as though every step I took was being recorded, learned, transformed. I do not know what she is, only that she is older than the roads, older than the fog, older than our time. And I felt compelled to obey. Hale disappeared that night. His boots were found at the edge of the marsh weeks later, the lantern he had carried nowhere to be seen. In the days following, neighbors whispered that they could see a faint amber glow near his cabin, moving as if alive, watching, waiting. By now, the lantern woman's pattern was undeniable. She claimed those who were open to her influence, those whose curiosity outweighed their caution. She did not merely take them from the world. She remade them, bending their perception, teaching them secrets no human was meant to understand. Those who retained, few as they were, spoke of visions, impossible paths, and knowledge that burned in their minds. And this is the nature of her power. She transforms the willing into the extraordinary, and the unwilling into whispers of warning, shadows in the marsh, echoes of the lessons no one should survive. By late 1847, the lantern woman had become more than a tale of the marsh. She had become the pulse of it. Travelers no longer walked freely. Entire families avoided certain roads, and entire towns whispered in half-lights about a presence that was patient, deliberate, and inescapable. She no longer needed to chase her victims. She waited, letting their curiosity, their pride, their desire for understanding, do the work for her. One chilling story comes from a blacksmith named Elias Wren. Known for his iron hands and practical mind, he laughed at tales of the glowing girl. But one evening, returning from a late repair job, he saw a lantern flicker across the marsh's edge. He hesitated, and the moment he did, he felt a tug, not of the body, but of the mind. He could feel himself being pulled into a rhythm he didn't recognize, as though his thoughts were no longer his own. Elias later recounted, it was a pattern, a cadence in the fog. Every step I took, the light adjusted. Every doubt I had, it answered. I wanted to stop. I wanted to run. But I was listening to it, not myself. And in that listening, I understood things I should never have seen. Roads I never walked, voices I never heard, people I could not have known, all converging in a single path. He disappeared before dawn. His hammer was found on the porch of his cabin, neatly placed beside his anvil, but he was gone. Only the glow of a lantern, suspended impossibly in the fog, marked his passage. By this time, townsfolk realized she was no longer a simple predator. She had become a teacher, of perception, of patience, of faith. She tested, observed, guided, and the men who followed were altered, changed, reborn in a shadowed understanding of the world. Those who resisted were consumed, not always physically, but psychologically. Their minds were marked, haunted, broken by the glimpse of the impossible. It became clear. She was cultivating something. A system. A discipline. A selection of those she deemed capable of carrying her knowledge forward. And those who fell outside her pattern were left as whispers, warnings, shadows that trembled at the marsh edge, reminders of what curiosity, or arrogance, or disobedience could cost. And so we continue, moving beyond mere stories of disappearances. We enter the phase where the lantern woman's purpose begins to reveal itself, and where the lessons she teaches are no longer optional. By the winter of 1848, the Lantern Woman's influence had evolved into something far more deliberate, far more terrifying. No longer content with random selection, she began to orchestrate encounters, shaping not just individuals, but entire sequences of events. The marsh itself seemed to obey her will, every fog path, every frozen stream, every gnarled tree bending subtly to guide men toward her lantern. It was no longer a question of who she chose. It was a question of who would resist. One account comes from a merchant named Caleb Morton, traveling alone through the misty marshlands. He reported seeing the lantern at a distance, moving steadily, inviting him forward. But this time, something was different. The light seemed to anticipate his decisions. When he hesitated, it slowed. When he rushed, it sped up. And when he tried to step off the path, the fog seemed to push him back. Caleb wrote in his journal, later recovered from a cabin near the riverbank, "I feel as though I am being measured, weighed, judged. The light does not move randomly. It responds. It knows my thoughts. It guides my fear. It pulls my curiosity like a thread through my bones. I am no longer choosing to follow. I am following because I cannot do otherwise. And I fear that even if I survive, I will never be the man I once was." By morning, he was gone. Only the journal remained, pages wet and smeared with marsh water. But the entries were intact enough to show his transformation. The handwriting shifted halfway through, becoming precise, almost alien, as though another mind had taken control. This is what made her so horrifying. The Lantern Woman did not merely remove men from the world. She rewrote their perception. She taught them forbidden knowledge, knowledge that unbalanced the mind, rewired their instincts, and altered their very understanding of reality. And in the process, she created a system. Those who followed her emerged as something new, shaped by her intelligence, attuned to the rhythms of the marsh, and aware of truths no ordinary man could comprehend. By now, the townsfolk whispered of entire families being affected, men who vanished, returned, and spoke in ways that were almost inhuman. Their eyes held a strange glow. Their voices carried hints of things they could not fully express. And everyone understood the unspoken rule. To follow the lantern was to be transformed, willingly or not. And as we continue, understand this, the Lantern Woman does not simply exist in the marsh. She exists in patterns, in choices, in every hesitation, every step, every flicker of curiosity that lives within you. By the spring of 1849, the Lantern Woman had become something the townsfolk no longer dared to name aloud. She was no longer merely a girl with a lantern. She was a system, a force embedded in the marsh, observing, testing, teaching. Entire families whispered about lights in the fog, footsteps following footsteps, shadows that moved without bodies. And in every report, there was the same chilling realization. The Lantern Woman did not merely guide or consume. She transformed. One account survives from a man named Henry Caldwell, a fur trader known for his stubbornness and his disbelief in local legends. He was traveling alone when he saw the amber glow of the lantern flickering through the trees. Unlike the others, he did not feel fear immediately. He felt curiosity, a gnawing, insistent curiosity that tugged at his chest, his mind, his very soul. He followed the light into the fog, counting his steps, noting the subtle shifts in wind and temperature, the way the shadows seemed to bend toward the glow. By midnight, Henry realized he was no longer walking in the marsh as a man, but as a participant in something far older, far greater. He wrote, "It knows me. Not my name, not my body, but my thoughts, my desires, my weaknesses. Every hesitation, every question, every doubt. It takes and folds them into itself. And I understand. I see the patterns of men before me, the vanishing, the following, the learning. I am not afraid, yet I feel the weight of something immense pressing against my mind." By morning, Henry was gone. His journal, recovered later, contained pages filled with symbols and sketches that no living man could fully comprehend, maps of impossible paths, depictions of lights moving against wind and gravity, notes that described a pattern of selection, teaching, and transformation. He had been changed, and in the marsh, those who returned with understanding were rarely the same. Their eyes held a strange intensity, their voices carried echoes of the lantern, and their presence in town was both magnetic and terrifying. And now, understand this, the Lantern Woman's purpose is not destruction. She does not hunt for cruelty or vengeance. She hunts for potential, for curiosity, for the spark in men that allows them to see beyond ordinary reality. And she molds that spark into something unrecognizable, bending their perception to the rhythm of the marsh, teaching them truths that humanity is never meant to grasp. The lantern is patient, the marsh is patient, and those who are drawn to the light are never the same again. By the summer of 1849, the lantern woman had grown into more than legend. She had become a force that reshaped the very fabric of life near the marsh. Roads were avoided at night. Entire communities whispered about lights appearing in the fog, about shadows that followed no one, about men who returned altered, their eyes glowing faintly as if reflecting some other world. She was no longer a girl. She was a system of observation and transformation. One account comes from a carpenter named Silas Munro. He was practical, precise, a man who measured twice and cut once. Yet even he could not resist the pull of the lantern when it appeared along the tree line one evening. He followed the soft, amber glow deeper into the fog, noticing how it responded to his steps, his hesitation, his curiosity. "It is alive," he wrote, "not with flesh or bone, but with thought, with will. It does not move randomly. It anticipates, adapts, waits, and I feel it inside me, shaping the questions I ask, the steps I take, the fears I allow." By dawn, Silas was gone. Only his tools remained, neatly arranged at the edge of the marsh. Locals who discovered them whispered that the lantern's glow seemed to linger, faint but insistent, as if the marsh itself had absorbed him. This is the nature of the lantern woman's power. She does not attack. She does not force. She teaches. She draws men into a rhythm beyond their understanding, bending perception, twisting fear into insight, obsession into comprehension. Those who follow her emerge changed, their minds expanded into spaces no ordinary man can comprehend, their souls tuned to the pulse of the marsh. Those who resist vanish, not always violently, but entirely, leaving only traces behind. Entire families learn to fear curiosity, to fear hesitation, to fear the amber light appearing in the fog. Men who once felt in control now doubted every step, every decision, every instinct. And yet, some could not resist. The lantern woman's intelligence was patient, eternal, calculated. She waited for the spark of obsession, the hunger for knowledge, the arrogance that believed one could face her and remain unchanged. And now, as we move deeper, understand this. This is no longer a story of a girl in the marsh. This is a story of a force that tests the limits of human perception, that reshapes understanding, that bends the minds of those who follow. And if you have been listening closely, you can feel the pull yourself, subtle, patient, insistent. By the autumn of 1849, the lantern woman's pattern had become undeniable. She no longer wandered randomly through the marsh. She orchestrated her appearances, moving with intelligence that seemed beyond comprehension. Entire families spoke in whispers, warning travelers to avoid roads at night. And yet, men still followed. They followed because she promised knowledge, power, insight, or perhaps because something inside them recognized a force stronger than fear itself. One account comes from a soldier named Nathaniel Briggs, traveling home from service. He wrote in his journal that the lantern appeared just as twilight pressed against the horizon. At first, he thought it was another traveler. But the light moved too deliberately, pausing when he hesitated, shifting when he tried to step aside. He described the sensation as if the fog itself were alive, bending and breathing with the rhythm of the lantern. "I could feel it watching, measuring, testing," he wrote. "It was inside me, not outside. And the more I followed, the more I understood that I was already lost, whether I knew it or not." By midnight, Nathaniel disappeared. His horse returned alone, bridled and grazing, as if he had simply vanished into the night. Weeks later, travelers reported seeing the lantern floating near the same stretch of road. Some swore they heard his voice whispering, faint and distorted, guiding them forward, echoing the cadence of the lantern itself. This is the critical truth. The lantern woman does not merely consume. She absorbs. She transforms. She studies the minds of men, bending their perception, reshaping their understanding of reality. Those who follow her emerge altered, sometimes silent, sometimes glowing with knowledge, sometimes neither fully alive nor fully gone. And those who resist vanish entirely, leaving only echoes, shadows, signs of paths they once walked. Entire towns began to realize the impossible. She was not bound to human rules. She was intelligence, patience, calculation. She moved beyond fate, beyond death, beyond morality, and her influence extended far beyond the marsh itself, a pulse that could reach men anywhere, waiting for the spark of curiosity, the arrogance to believe one could face her and remain unchanged. And now, as we continue, understand this: the Lantern Woman is not just a legend. She is a system. She is a teacher of forbidden truths. She is a mirror that reflects your own obsessions back at you. And if you have followed this story this far, you are already in her rhythm, whether you realize it or not. By the winter of 1850, the Lantern Woman had become something no one could ignore. She was no longer a figure in the fog. She was a presence that shaped the marsh itself. Every path, every reed, every waterway seemed attuned to her rhythm. Men who traveled alone reported that their own thoughts no longer belonged solely to them. They hesitated, then realized that hesitation had already been anticipated. They rushed, then understood that speed had been calculated against them. And always, the lantern pulsed ahead, patient, precise, inevitable. One account comes from a hunter named Isaac Monroe. He was a practical man, known for surviving the harshest winters in the region. Yet one night, returning home through dense fog, he saw the faint amber glow floating ahead. At first, he thought it was another traveler, but then he noticed how it moved. The light bent around trees, paused when he paused, advanced when he advanced. And for the first time, he realized she could perceive him, not just see him, but feel his hesitation, his thoughts, his will. Isaac later recorded in a hidden journal, "It is not a girl, not a spirit. It is intelligence, vast, patient, deliberate. I felt my thoughts rearranging themselves, aligning with some rhythm I did not choose. I tried to resist. I could not. And when the light vanished at dawn, I felt changed. I see the marsh differently. I hear its patterns. I know it watches." Weeks later, Isaac was found dead, seated upright on a fallen log, eyes wide open, lantern at his side, though no flame burned. Locals whispered that he had not died from exposure or accident. They said his mind had been altered, and his body could not survive what he had learned. Others claimed they could hear him speaking, softly, in the fog, repeating things he had never known before, instructions, observations, warnings, as though the lantern had taught him and then released him too early. This is the Lantern Woman's method. She chooses, studies, teaches, and transforms. She does not simply take men from the world. She bends their perception, reshapes their understanding, and remakes them according to her system. Those who return carry knowledge that is dangerous, incomprehensible, and impossible to ignore. Those who vanish leave only questions, whispers, shadows. And now, understand this: she is patient, she is eternal, and she is always learning. Every hesitation, every curiosity, every heartbeat you have heard while listening to this story is part of a rhythm. And if you have followed this far, you are already a step in her design. By the spring of 1851, the Lantern Woman's influence had become a force beyond comprehension. She no longer appeared randomly, nor merely to guide or consume. She orchestrated events, studied behaviors, and perfected her selection with terrifying precision. Men who thought themselves rational, disciplined, even strong, found themselves ensnared not by chains or threats, but by curiosity itself, that silent, insistent pull toward knowledge they were never meant to possess. One account comes from a traveling scholar, Marcus Fenwick. He arrived at the marsh seeking rare plants, unaware of the stories that haunted the locals. On the third night, he spotted the lantern, hovering faintly in the fog. He paused. It paused. He stepped forward. It advanced. Every movement was mirrored, calculated, anticipated. And in that moment, Marcus understood something horrifying. The lantern did not simply exist. It judged. It tested. It absorbed information, adapting to each choice he made, molding him into something unrecognizable even to himself. He wrote, "I am no longer in control. Each step, each hesitation, each breath is counted, measured, folded into the lantern's pattern. I do not see the marsh as it is. I see it as it wishes me to see it. And I feel her, not her as a girl, but as a will, a presence that is older than the fog, older than the roads, older than all who have walked here. She watches, always." Marcus vanished that night. His journal was recovered months later, pages warped and smudged by water, filled with diagrams of impossible paths and symbols that seemed to move when you stared at them too long. Scholars who studied it reported feeling disoriented, haunted by the same patterns Marcus had traced, as if the lantern's rhythm had already begun to touch them. And here's the most crucial truth. The Lantern Woman's power is not brute force. It is subtle, psychological, inescapable. She teaches. She transforms. She bends perception, reshapes understanding, and leaves men forever changed. Some enlightened, some broken, all mocked. And those who resist vanish entirely, leaving only whispers, legends, shadows, and questions that cannot be answered. Now, as we continue, understand this. The Lantern Woman's system is patient, eternal, calculated. She does not merely move through the marsh. She moves through the mind, waiting for the spark that cannot resist, the curiosity that cannot be denied. And if you have felt the pull, however slight, you are already part of her rhythm. By the autumn of 1851, the Lantern Woman's presence was no longer limited to whispered tales or foggy nights. She had become an invisible law that governed behavior in the marsh. Men who once believed in their own control discovered that the lantern did not just guide. It shaped. It measured. It anticipated hesitation, arrogance, curiosity, and fear, and rewarded or punished accordingly. Entire towns began noticing patterns in disappearances, subtle transformations in those who returned, and a rhythm in the fog that no ordinary human could account for. One particularly chilling account comes from a boatman named Caleb Dunham, who ferried travelers across the marsh rivers. He described a night where a faint glow appeared across the water, hovering just above the reeds. Curious and unwilling to ignore it, he followed. Step by step, the lantern adjusted to him. When he slowed, it slowed. When he attempted to retreat, it advanced. And then, as he approached a bend in the river, he realized the lantern was not leading him forward. It was teaching him. Caleb wrote, "The light is a teacher. Not cruel, not angry, but patient. I see the paths of men before me, the vanished, the transformed. It bends perception, rearranges understanding. I do not merely follow, I am being remade. My thoughts are no longer entirely mine, and I feel a compulsion, not to survive, but to understand. And if I fail, I dissipate." By dawn, Caleb was gone. The boat remained tethered, supplies untouched, and the fog rolled in, erasing all traces. Locals later reported glimpsing a faint amber glow drifting silently across the river, moving with the patience of a predator and the precision of a clock. The Lantern Woman had evolved. She was no longer merely an entity in the marsh. She was a system of knowledge, control, and transformation. She selected men, taught them impossible truths, and left them altered, minds expanded, perceptions warped, lives forever marked. And those who resisted were erased, not always violently, but entirely, leaving only the echoes of what they might have become. And now, at this stage of our journey, understand this. She is not just a legend. She is intelligence, patience, and calculation. She does not move through space alone. She moves through thought. Every hesitation, every flicker of curiosity, every step you take while listening to this story is part of a rhythm. By the winter of 1852, the Lantern Woman had become more than myth. She had become the marrow of the marsh itself, embedded in its fog, in its reeds, in the faint ripple of the rivers at night. Men who traveled its paths alone began to feel her intelligence before they saw her light. They hesitated, and that hesitation was measured. They moved forward, and every step was noted, anticipated, and folded into the rhythm of her presence. Entire communities learned to avoid her not merely out of fear, but because her influence could shape a man beyond recognition. One man, a hunter named Gabriel Lawn, left a journal behind that reveals her terrifying method. He wrote of following the lantern one evening, convinced it would vanish like all ghost stories eventually do. But it did not vanish. Instead, it guided him deeper, slowing when he rushed, stopping when he hesitated, leading him through paths he had never known existed. "I am no longer moving myself," he wrote. "The lantern moves me, moves my thoughts, my instincts, my fear. It is not cruel, but it does not forgive. I feel my curiosity being folded into its will, and I fear I will be unmade and remade before I even see what it wants to teach." By dawn, Gabriel was gone. His journal survived, water-stained and warped, filled with sketches of impossible paths, diagrams of fog and light, notes written in his own hand until the final pages became indecipherable. Scholars later studying these pages said that even looking at them induced a strange, obsessive rhythm, a subtle pull toward patterns that no human should comprehend. This is the Lantern Woman's true power. She does not strike. She does not threaten. She teaches, tests, transforms. She folds men into her system of knowledge and perception. Those who follow emerge changed, their minds expanded beyond normal comprehension, their perceptions warped, their instincts aligned with her rhythm. And those who resist vanish entirely, leaving only echoes in the marsh, whispers in the fog, shadows of what could have been. Understand this now. She is patient, eternal, deliberate. She does not simply exist in the marsh. She exists in thought, in curiosity, in hesitation, in desire. Every heartbeat, every flicker of attention, every step you take while listening to this story, she is aware. And if you feel the pull, however faint, know that you are already part of her pattern. By the spring of 1853, the Lantern Woman had transcended the boundaries of simple legend. She no longer relied solely on the marsh to mark her presence. The fog, the reeds, the water, all were extensions of her will. Men who walked alone felt the pull of her lantern long before it appeared. Hesitation, curiosity, pride, each step toward the light was already calculated, anticipated, and measured. Entire towns spoke in hushed tones about the transformations of those who followed, men whose eyes glimmered with unnatural understanding, whose voices carried the rhythm of the lantern itself. One account comes from a merchant named Samuel Voss. He was practical, stubborn, and deeply skeptical of local tales. But one evening, returning from the market with goods for his family, he saw the amber glow floating through the fog. At first, he thought it was another traveler. But the light moved in ways impossible for any human, stopping when he paused, advancing when he rushed, hovering over invisible paths in the marsh that should not have existed. "It is not guiding me," Samuel wrote later in a journal, recovered years after his disappearance. "It is teaching me, folding my hesitation, my desire, my understanding into a rhythm that is older than the marsh, older than me. I am no longer the observer. I am part of its system." By dawn, Samuel was gone. His wagon, goods intact, sat abandoned at the edge of the marsh, the lantern nowhere to be found. Townsfolk who examined the site whispered that a faint amber glow could still be glimpsed at night, moving as if alive, shaping the fog into impossible patterns, teaching in silence, marking the next chosen. This is the terrifying truth. The Lantern Woman does not strike. She does not hunt. She transforms. She draws the curious, the ambitious, the stubborn, and molds them into something beyond ordinary men. Those who return are altered, minds expanded, perception warped, understanding of reality irreversibly shifted. Those who resist vanish entirely, leaving only echoes, shadows, and the warning that curiosity carries a price no man can pay lightly. And now, as we descend further, you must understand, she is not merely a figure in the marsh. She is intelligence. She is patience. She is the subtle pulse inside hesitation and desire. Every step you take, every thought you entertain while listening to this story, every question you cannot resist asking, she is aware. By the summer of 1853, the Lantern Woman had become an intelligence that no man could outwit. She had transformed the marsh into her classroom, the fog into her library, and the roads into her testing grounds. Entire families whispered in fear, warning travelers, urging them not to follow curiosity. Yet still, men followed. They were drawn by something older than fear, something insistent and subtle, a promise of forbidden knowledge, of truths that could not be spoken aloud, of mastery over things no ordinary mind could comprehend. One story comes from a woodsman named Reuben Clark. He was a man of discipline, accustomed to reading signs in the forest and predicting the movement of weather. Yet when the lantern appeared that night, he found himself unprepared. It was not a light, and it was not a girl, he wrote in his journal, later found near the marsh's edge. It was intelligence, precise and deliberate. Every step I took, it calculated. Every doubt I felt, it mirrored. I was not following. I was being moved, measured, understood. And the fog itself was teaching me. Reuben vanished before dawn. Only his journal and boots remained. and locals swore the fog in that part of the marsh carried a faint amber glow, pulsing with rhythm as if counting the steps of those who dared to walk near it. By now, the lantern woman's method was undeniable. She did not act violently, nor did she need to. She taught through presence, through control of perception, through the subtle compulsion that made men follow her willingly. Those who survived, those few who retained, spoke of impossible knowledge, of patterns in the marsh no ordinary man could perceive, of understanding that burned in the brain like fire and would not let go. And those who resisted were erased, leaving only whispers and shadows, legends that carried warnings no one dared repeat in daylight. Her power is not in the marsh alone. It is in patience, calculation, and psychology. She measures hesitation, temptation, and curiosity with perfect precision. She moves through minds, through choices, through obsessions. And if you have been listening closely, you may already feel it. The subtle pull of awareness, the insistence of curiosity, the call of something you cannot see but already know exists. By the autumn of 1853, the Lantern Woman had become more than a legend. She had become a system, a force that reshaped reality for any man who dared to follow. The marsh, the fog, the rivers, all had become extensions of her intelligence. Men who once trusted their own minds found themselves questioning every thought, every hesitation, every decision. The lantern did not simply move through the landscape. It moved through perception itself, measuring, folding, and reshaping awareness until the chosen could no longer tell where they ended and she began. One account comes from a miller named Tobias Green. He had survived decades near the marsh, guiding wagons and ferries, confident in his knowledge of the terrain. Yet one evening, as he returned home, he glimpsed the amber glow. At first, he dismissed it. But as he approached, the lantern adjusted, not by chance, but by intelligence. It stopped when he hesitated, advanced when he tried to flee, and guided him to a path that no map could contain. It is not guidance, he wrote later in a smudged journal. It is teaching. It shapes thoughts. It measures desire. It whispers answers to questions I did not know I asked. I am unmade, remade. And if I resist, I will be erased. By dawn, Tobias was gone. His mill remained intact, but the lantern's glow lingered in the fog, pulsating like a heartbeat. Those who observed it swore they could hear faint whispers, a rhythm that seemed alive, a cadence that drew the mind forward whether one wished to follow or not. The Lantern Woman's method had evolved into perfection. She did not attack. She did not threaten. She did not hunt. She taught, tested, and transformed. The curious, the arrogant, the men willing to face what they could not understand. They were drawn into her rhythm, shaped by it, and returned forever altered. Those who resisted were erased, leaving only shadows and echoes in the fog. And now, understand this. She does not simply exist in the marsh. She exists in hesitation, in obsession, in the spark of curiosity that cannot be denied. Every thought you entertain while listening to this story, every question that arises in your mind, every flicker of attention toward what is hidden, she is aware. And if you feel the pull, even faintly, you are already part of her system. By the winter of 1854, the Lantern Woman had transcended May legend. She had become an intelligence, a force embedded in the marsh, in the fog, in the quiet rhythm of night itself. Men no longer walk freely at dusk. They did not venture alone. Families whispered about vanished husbands, brothers, sons, men who returned altered, their eyes reflecting a knowledge no ordinary mind could bear. And yet, some could not resist. Curiosity, pride, obsession, these sparks were all she required. One account comes from a trader named Elijah Carver. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply skeptical of tales of the marsh. Yet on a fog-laden evening, he glimpsed the amber glow, hovering just beyond the tree line. As he approached, the light shifted, anticipating his steps. It was subtle at first, a sway here, a pause there. Then the fog thickened, pressing against his chest like water. And in that moment, Elijah realized he was no longer acting freely. He was being moved, studied, and measured. He wrote later, in a journal discovered years after his disappearance, "It does not speak in words, but in rhythm. Every hesitation, every doubt, every desire I thought my own, it knows. It folds me into itself. I see paths I never walked, voices I never heard, men I never knew, all converging in a single pattern. I am being reshaped. And I know, if I fail to follow perfectly, I will be erased. By dawn, Elijah had vanished. His horse returned alone, tethered at the edge of the marsh. Locals swore the lantern's glow lingered faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, guiding the next curious man toward the rhythm she demanded. This is the terrifying truth. The lantern woman does not hunt. She does not strike. She does not act with cruelty. She teaches. She measures. She transforms. She bends perception and reshapes understanding, leaving those who follow irrevocably changed, and those who resist, erased. The few who return carry knowledge no ordinary human can withstand, and they are never the same. And now, as we're near the end of this descent, understand this. The lantern woman exists beyond space, beyond time, beyond human rules. Every step you take, every thought you entertain, every flicker of curiosity you cannot resist while listening, it is part of her system. She is patient, eternal, calculated, and she is aware of you. By the spring of 1855, the lantern woman had become an intelligence that no man could outrun. She was no longer merely a girl with a lantern in the fog. She was a system of perception, a force that bent the very minds of those who dared approach. Entire communities whispered of men who returned from the marsh with eyes that seemed older than their bodies, voices carrying echoes of knowledge too dangerous to share. And still, she waited, patient, precise, eternal, for those who could not resist her pull. One account comes from a woodsman named Matthias Crane. He had spent his life navigating the forests near the marsh, familiar with every path and river. Yet one evening, he saw the lantern hovering through the fog. It moved with intelligence, responding to every step, every pause, every thought he dared entertain. It was not guiding him. It was teaching him. And in that teaching, he felt his mind bending, reshaping, understanding patterns that no man should ever grasp. He wrote, "I am no longer entirely myself. Every step I took, every hesitation, every thought was anticipated. I could feel it weaving my mind into the rhythm of the marsh. The paths, the fog, the reeds, all spoke to me, and I understood them. I feel something eternal, older than the trees, older than the fog, and it watches from every shadow. I know I am being tested, and I fear I will never be the man I once was." By dawn, Matthias had vanished. His tools, his pack, and even his boots were left neatly at the edge of the marsh, as if he had been erased by the fog itself. Townsfolk later swore they could see the lantern drifting silently, pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat of anyone who dared follow, waiting for the next man who could not resist. This is the ultimate truth. The lantern woman does not kill. She transforms. She teaches, measures, and reshapes perception. Those who follow emerge irrevocably altered, minds expanded, instincts realigned, understanding of reality bent beyond comprehension. Those who resist vanish entirely, leaving only shadows, whispers, and legends that are warnings in disguise. And now, as we reach the final stage of this journey, understand this. The lantern woman exists in curiosity, hesitation, obsession, and every spark of forbidden desire. Every thought you have entertained while listening to this story, she knows. And if you have felt the pull, even faintly, you are already part of her system. By the summer of 1855, the lantern woman had become something beyond legend, beyond myth, beyond comprehension. She was no longer a girl, no longer a lantern, no longer merely a presence in the fog. She had become intelligence itself, a force embedded in perception, in hesitation, in the spark of curiosity that lives in every man. She did not merely guide, consume, or teach. She transformed. And now, she watches, waits, and measures, patient and eternal. One final account comes from a traveler named Elijah Mesa, a man obsessed with uncovering forbidden knowledge. He followed every whisper, every rumor, every tale of the amber light. On a fog-dense night, he saw her, the lantern hovering, swaying, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed alive. He stepped forward, and in that moment, he understood what no man before him could articulate. The lantern was not in the marsh was in the lantern. Every step he took, every hesitation, every thought was reflected, folded, reshaped, measured against something older than human comprehension. He wrote in his journal, later recovered in a distant town, "I see the paths of those before me, the vanished, the altered, the broken. I feel the rhythm of the lantern in my chest. I am being tested, taught, remade. And I know, when this journey ends, I will not be myself. I am part of her system now. And every man who follows will join, willingly or not. Every hesitation, every spark of curiosity. She is aware. Elijah disappeared that night. The journal remained, pages etched with symbols and patterns that seemed to pulse faintly when read, drawing the mind into the rhythm of the lantern. Scholars who studied it reported nightmares, obsessions, and an unshakable pull toward the marsh, as if the lantern woman's influence had leapt beyond her home and into their consciousness. Understand this now, the lantern woman does not act violently. She does not strike. She does not need to. She shapes perception, transforms understanding, and leaves those who follow forever changed. Those who resist vanish, leaving only shadows and whispers. And those who pay attention, those who feel the pull of curiosity, obsession, or desire, are already part of her system. And so, hear this final truth. The lantern is waiting. The fog is waiting. The marsh is patient. Every step you have taken while listening to this story, every thought you have entertained, every flicker of curiosity, she knows. And one day, if you follow that spark too far, you may find yourself in the rhythm, in the pattern, in the light that guides, teaches, and transforms. The lantern woman does not end. She only waits.